Thank you, everybody. We're on the third panel of the day, honoring Stanley Aranowitz under the title of Carry It On. I delivered a little bit of a homage earlier to Stanley's theoretical work, and I'm going to be a moderator here for the panel titled Education and Culture Still Under Siege. Dead artists, live theories. We could also say maybe dead teachers, add that into this since it's on education and the culture too. What has happened to the academy, etc. I'm pleased to be joined by many people. We're going to have 4 speakers and then a Q&A, a kind of roundtable situation. I'm going to begin today. I'll introduce people as they speak, but you can see we have Andrew Anastasia here as our first speaker, and then Michelle Fine will follow Andrew, and then we're going to go on to Lynn Chancellor and Kristin Lawler. But first, I'll introduce Andrew to give a his little presentation, and then we'll riff on it. I just want to say I've been with Stanley a long time, a good 30 years, talking about alternative education, many struggles we've done. We helped found the Institute for the Radical Imagination, and we are establishing a memorial lecture in the name of Stanley Aranowitz, the Stanley Aranowitz Memorial Lecture, which will be an annual thing. And if you're interested in hearing more about this and actually donating to the fund, there'll be a featured speaker each year. You can go to radicalimagination.institute, and you can see a page for this with a notice about Stanley's contributions and what the memorial lecture will encompass. Anyway, all to say, Stanley, in my view, was one of the great masters of thinking and walking the line between being in the institution, yeah, but not of it, right? And actually being able to found institutions outside of both of and in the dominant institutions. And this is a very important thing to remember. We had many talks about the old slogan of Rudy Dutschke, with the long march through the institutions, be effective. And how do you counter this in terms of not being swallowed by the academism, the careerism, et cetera. So I'm sure a lot of these questions will be addressed today on the schooling end, and we're going to go also to the cultural end. And again, as was pointed out this morning by Cornell West, this was a person that was so far reaching that labor, political economy, education, culture, and one aspect we could talk about in culture is music, which should have been a feature program, because this was Stanley's really great love. And I'll point out too that the last reading Stanley always had on his desk was the great Dr. Faustus of Thomas Mann, of which Theodore Adorno was the interlocutor and the assistant to Mann in putting together the life and work, somewhat modeled on Arnold Schoenberg. So we hopefully can go there with the culture a little bit. It's certainly an aspect of Stanley's thought that has not been talked about much, as also film, another seminal essay. So we'll go back to that. But first, I want to introduce Andrew. Very pleased to have him here. Andrew is a PhD candidate at the Graduate Center in I think sociology, right? You came to study with Stanley, and Stanley was very fond of Andrew, and especially that he was working on Mario Tronti, one of Stanley's favorites of the Italian, worker movements, autonomia, et cetera, of the early Negre Tronti faction. Andrew teaches at Fordham and has written a commentary on Mario Tronti as well as translating. So he brings a lot of chops to the table. And and Andrew, I'm going to let you go ahead. I can still speak about the Italian scene, but that's for you to do and your work with Stanley in that regard. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone for allowing me to be a part of this. It's really a privilege and an honor. I have had only known Stanley since 2014. So I have probably the least experience conspiring and working with him on this panel. And so primarily I'm here to learn and hear some stories. So I really will not go on too long, but I do want to talk about a few elements of Stanley's commitment to pedagogy, politics, and as well as theory. And so part of what I want to do is make a very brief theoretical intervention as well, sort of in his honor. But the other thing I wanted to say just by way of a preface is that even though I'd only met Stanley when he was in his 80s, he always, as Cornel West pointed out this morning, he always had time for younger people, for his students, both those who were formally enrolled in programs that he administered or taught in, and people who sought him out for, for some guiding lights. So, 80 years of comrades and commitments that he accumulated, he still had time for me, and I really appreciated that, and we all miss him very much. The Great Resignation and Striketober have come up several times today already, and the strike at John Deere in particular saw workers win massive raises, which it did not seem likely that they would achieve, especially without a strike. This embodied something that Stanley and the Italian workers of the 1960s and 70s prioritized, which was the refusal of work, right? Not the valorization of labor, the dignity of labor being the primary goal of a workers' movement, but rather the refusal to work by workers, embodied in their everyday practices and actions. And Stanley did indeed, as Michael pointed out, draw from Mario Tronti, Antonio Negri, Raniero Panzieri, and later Maurizio Lazzarato, who sort of came out of this school as well, influenced also by Felix Guattari. And these thinkers represented a heterodox current in Italian Marxism. But one of the things that they introduced into the discussion at the time, and which I know Stanley was aware of and Stanley came to prioritize himself, was a shift in paradigm from speaking about consciousness to subjectivity. And especially in the mid-2010s, I noticed this in Stanley's writing. While he used consciousness in his earliest works, especially False Promises, he gradually came to a sort of a new disposition, which was to use the term subjectivity. And I wanted to read something brief from his essay from the mid-2010s, Where is the Outrage?, that sort of highlights the reason for this shift, because I do think it's important when we're thinking about the relationship of education to activism, when we're thinking about the relationship of leadership to something that Rosa Luxemburg and others may have discussed in terms of spontaneity. And so I just want to share this quote from Stanley. The fundamental question is subjectivity. How have the people introjected or resisted domination? What are the fundamental influences on how they become social and political actors? Subjectivity is not merely based on consciousness, but involves the will to act. It is not enough for individuals and social formations to recognize their oppression by external powers over which they have little or no control. The question is why in the United States is protest and resistance sporadic and episodic, right? So, and he goes on to sort of critique theses of mass ignorance, notions of rational discourse and the sort of enlightenment of truth being immediate precursors to radicalization and mass social action. And I think that this is very important, in part because it demolishes the idealist notion of consciousness as this sort of thing that's waiting in the wings for people to properly achieve through schooling, right? Or maybe through a sort of different sort of education than what Stanley would advocate. And it also focuses on the problem of the constitution of collective subjects, right? Not only individual subjectivity, but collective social and political subjectivity. And these were things that he and I talked about a lot in the few short years that we got to know each other. One reading of subjectivity could suggest a sort of refusal of organization, right? That if workers are already resigning from their jobs en masse and already going on strike, then there is no need for any sort of critical, political, public intellectual activity to be in a dialogue with those struggling subjects, right? And Stanley, of course, as many people have talked about, Stanley rode this line and dealt with this contradiction. He lived within this contradiction between organization and spontaneity, if you will. And I think that to turn briefly to critical pedagogy, right, which Stanley was a major figure in the kind of American appropriation of Paulo Freire's ideas from Brazil. Stanley's interest in critical pedagogy, I think, is closely linked to this, because if outrage does exist, if a strategy of refusal does exist among workers who see that, and everyday people, if we want to expand the category beyond the traditional notion of the worker, certainly, as Stanley would, if people embody this suspicion of the capitalist system, of the way that things are as not being inevitable, certainly not being in their best interests all the time, nevertheless, that outrage needs to be cultivated, right? And it needs to be organized. What this looks like is historically contingent and specific, but I think Stanley was always interested in this question of organizing outrage and ideological struggle, broadly conceived, right? We saw in the talk that bridged these last two panels, which was a pleasure to watch, that Stanley was very insistent on the need for left institutions that were large enough and able to sustain for long enough the energy that is emitted by the upsurges like those that we're seeing lately, again, in Striketober and in the Great Resignation. So Stanley was interested in participating in that production of radical subjectivity, not merely in documenting it or knowing that it was going on. He was interested in participating in really cultivating a long-term radical organizational subjectivity. And as Michael also very helpfully prefaced, sometimes this involved a long march through institutions. So Stanley was perpetually engaged in this struggle of being both within and against institutions, being in them but not of them. And certainly to his credit, and also just another way of putting it that I think Cornel West put very well this morning was that Stanley was unsubsumable, right? But that did not mean that he, as we all recognized here, that did not mean that he eschewed engagement with mainstream institutions, whether they be the public education system in New York City, whether they be the organized labor movement, nationally. It didn't mean a stance of purity and avoidance of engagement with those institutions. But nevertheless, Stanley was always engaged in this problem of autonomy, right? How to establish and maintain autonomy, not at a distance from the state or from these institutions, but enmeshed within their relations. And so I think I'll leave it there because I've gone on long enough, but I hope I put some ideas on the table that resonate with what others are thinking. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It was excellent, and you've lit the fires. It's very nice to do. As good Italians do, they bring the labor of fire back to to North America. So I'm proud to introduce here, secondly, Michelle Fine, who is a distinguished professor of both critical psychology, women's studies, American studies, and urban education. So he covering the water frontier. I think the last book was The Changing Landscape of Political Education. I don't know if I'm correct about this, but this is what I'm gleaning, but many contributions since then. And before that, Charter Schools and the Corporate Makeover of Public Education. Very long list of publications that we really don't need to go through. You can certainly check out her bio online, but we're really pleased to have her. The last time I heard Michelle was in the Left Forum with Mike Fabricant honoring Stanley's work, and he was present and extremely taken by Michelle's presentation. He was wowing in the men's room afterwards. So anyway, I'm serious. Yeah, I like telling these little stories. A lot of people don't, he doesn't tell you up front. He tells it in different capacities. That's so welcome, hilarious. Michelle. Looking forward to hearing from you. And yeah.
That's hilarious, Michael. Thank you. And thanks, Greg and Lynn, for inviting me. Thanks, Michael, for hosting. I want to say that I've worked with and known Stanley for probably 40 years. I think we met in the 80s around Paulo Freire. There was a small group of us who just followed the guy around and chatted with him. And then at retreats at Bergen and Garvey, the publisher where Stanley and Henry did a lot of his publications. So let me say what I loved about Stanley, what I found hilarious about Stanley, and what I miss about Stanley. And even before I do that, I just want to say something about this morning. Cornell, I want to thank you for reminding the audience that Stanley and Rosa Luxemburg were long lost siblings, old Jews from somewhere, who held a kind of radical spirit of possibility against the odds. And as Rosa has said, the most revolutionary thing one can do is to proclaim what is happening in the everyday. And that is certainly what Stanley did wherever he was. And then, Michael, I thank you this morning, not only for being eloquent, but for being emotional and inviting all of us to be. So I always want to honor the first who releases a tear, because it's actually a gift to the rest of us. And I loved hearing and seeing Nona, who I haven't seen for a while, but I must say that in the elevators, Stanley would talk to me about her often, and I just loved that the two of them had a study group, and he asked her to read Madame Bovary. Who could make this shit up? So there are a lot of hilarious stories that I'll get to, but Stanley telling you in the bathroom that he liked my comments about him is classic Stanley. Every time I was with Stanley, and it was a lot, he was always late to a meeting, but it was never like late because sorry, I was in the bathroom, or sorry, you know, I slept. It was like, sorry, I'm running for governor. Sorry, I'm like, it was like a big reason. And I will get to that theme of big, which he, of course, introduced in the title of the C. Wright Mills book. But I think that was more autoethnographic than he might want to admit. So as Cornell started us this morning, one of the things I loved about Stanley, that he was an unapologetic, radical, secular Jew from the Bronx. And every part of that sentence was as important. He didn't step away from it. He wasn't romantic about any of it. But in his fullness, he embraced all of that. And what he took to mean a Jew from the Bronx was a political commitment, and a commitment of faith in what's possible, not faith in a religion, not faith in an institution. He was a kind of unapologetic excess. He was like too much for every category. He was too much as a sociologist, as a GC faculty member, as a union member. And he was proud of he was too much sometimes for his clothes. He was just too much. And Jim Bergen from Bergen and Garvey said, what I remember is he would give talks without notes, and dinner would be all over his shirt. And it was that kind of gorgeous combination of brilliance and humanity and solidarity that defined so much of what we've heard all morning and so much of what we know Stanley to be. I think one of the other things that I loved about Stanley, and I can't tell which is adjective and which is noun, but he was either a romantic abolitionist or an abolitionist romantic. That is, he wanted to bust open any institution that he was associated with, and he loved what it strived to be. And that's certainly how he felt about CUNY. It's certainly how he felt about the PSC. It's certainly how he felt about sociology, that he wanted to bust it open. He was deeply critical, and yet he savored the essence of each of those institutions and practices. So for instance, he was seduced by education, but deeply critical of schools. He was seduced by labor justice, but deeply critical of unions. He understood the importance of ongoing study, but not simply in the academy. And Andrew, as you just suggested, he was taken by subjectivity, but refused to reduce it to a fixed notion of consciousness. So he was just big, he was just bold, he was eager to bust out of the constraints, but he always sutured critique to radical imagination. And I so appreciated that about Stanley. For those of us at the Graduate Center, we know that we are thick in critique, but not always elegantly engaged with imagining how else things might be. And that's why I want to call him a radical abolitionist or an abolitionist romantic, because he held on by desire, but also obligation to what must be. And I do believe he thought that was the obligation of the organic intellectual, not only to help people see the harms and the blood and the violence and the greed and the profit, but to imagine what else is possible. I think he worried that despair could kill the spirit of the possible. So I will stop there by what I loved, although I also loved that he called his own family unschooled and highly educated. He was like very happy in those little contradictory moments. All right, hilarious stories. I'll try to do this quickly. So in 1995, I was with Stanley on the New Visions project, and New Visions was a small grant from the Diamond Foundation to CUNY to reimagine higher education. And so in Stanley's mind, I think it was like a $70,000 grant, became a playground for reimagining intellectual, ethical, and political life at CUNY, which he always called the People's University. May it remember that's its mission. So he took the New Visions money and he invited grants from every campus at CUNY. Teams of faculty would bring forth a kind of radical vision of what was possible. Then it was Black studies, urban studies, labor studies, queer studies. And I remember sitting there with him, and this is always Michael when he was late, and again, never because he was in the bathroom, always because he was doing something very important. But Stanley was their audience. I remember when the group from Medgar Evers came in, and people wanted to touch his intellect and his imagination. And then the group from the College of Staten Island, really different styles, right? And Stanley allowed us to understand this was all CUNY, that this was the collective of which we were born and building, to be a university not yet for all of the children of the city, with a kind of radical possibility, but also embedded in the institution. That is, he lived in the membrane of what is and what could be, never abandoning either. And in that ways, he was just such an optimist. Sometimes in the creepiest analytic ways, but he held on to what was possible. Once I was speaking at the Left Forum, I guess not when I was speaking on Stanley, and Stanley came in, he had these like Kramer entrances, like Seinfeld, remember, like, so if Rosa Luxemburg and Kramer had a baby, he'd come in and he'd say, I'm sorry I'm late, but oh my God, sociology is normalizing at the Graduate Center. It was like he was gonna fix it that afternoon. That's why he was 10 minutes late. And he worried about the death of things that he loved, not just Ellen, but a radical sociology, a university that was about reimagining knowledge, people's knowledge. I'll stop with hilarious, but he was hilarious, and where I miss him. So James Baldwin has the notion of the after times. So think about Stanley in the after times, and what of Stanley do we need now? Do we want to take forward? do we carry in our DNA, in our marrow. And what I miss most is his capacity for continual subversion and loyalty. It was really a remarkable braid of radical imagination. I miss most the unapologetic utopian, and I miss most the voice who would speak a kind of truth institutionally without walking out of the room. It was like truth as foreplay to engagement, rather than truth as an exit song. So Stanley, we will miss you. Michael, thank you for inviting, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. This was great. Thank you very much. And the three categories we can go back to: love, laughter, and missing, and beautiful on the after time of James Baldwin, and certainly speaks to the title of this conference of Carry It On. Good. So I'm going to pass the torch now to Lynn Chancellor, who is the chair of the Graduate Center Sociology Department currently. I've known Lynn through Stanley many, many years. The first time I met her, Stanley gave us a long dissertation on the way back from the Graduate Center in his then Volvo to Park Slope. And on the way home, we learned more about the garment industry and outsourcing in Brooklyn near Fort Greene and Pratt Institute than most people learn in a whole lifetime in sociology of labor departments. So anyway, I remember Lynn very fondly during that time, and she wrote I think her first book under Stanley called Sadomasochism in Everyday Life, The Dynamics of Power and Powerlessness, which was 1991. I know Lynn was also present in Stanley's book project and study group on Science as Power, where we'll go later today. So she has a very long intellectual and personal friendship with Stanley, and I think all of us here a very enormous consistency in keeping in touch through the institution, keeping in touch with what Stanley was doing. And actually, I think also being, I remember Lynn, when the Mills book came out and we did a conference on Mills, a very, very, very rigorous presentation on the work of C. Wright Mills during that as well. So she's always been there. She also wrote a book called Reconcilable Differences, Confronting Beauty, Pornography, and the Future of Feminism, and a book on gender, race, and class, co-authors with Beverly Watkins. And I think currently, and this is, I think where Lynn really excels, in my opinion. I haven't read all her work, but I've read certainly some of it, and The Unhappy Divorce of Sociology and Psychoanalysis. So this is a co-edited volume. She's done 18 essays that has recently come out, in the last 5 years. So thank you, Lynn, for being here. She helped put together this, has been a great force in getting this together, spoke at Stanley's memorial in Park Slope, and we were really happy to have her. And Lynn, welcome, and yeah, take the floor, please. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So, excuse me for this. I wrote out a few comments, which I'm going to read, and I appreciated what Michelle said about Michael, and if a tear comes to mind, because it's very moving, and the whole day is so evocative of how much Stanley meant and how much we're all going to miss Stanley. So let me begin. One of my earliest memories of Stanley Aranowitz, from whom I took numerous courses before he became my dissertation advisor and longstanding friend, returns to when I was an undergraduate student, a progressive myself, and the images of other progressives I knew on campus, usually young men. I was a feminist socialist in those days, but young men walking around campus with Stanley's book, False Promises, under their arms, eager to hear Stanley speak in an upcoming event. And the picture that comes to mind is of this young Stanley, charismatic and full of enthusiasm about one of the book's arguments and messages, namely that education and mass education were creating expectations about meaningful lives and work, expectations that the capitalist economy might have difficulty in fulfilling for young people in mass. In other words, there was a contradiction between capitalism's promises and realities that leftists needed to address and organize around. A second memory is of a much older Stanley, 80 years plus, still teaching out of his apartment near the Graduate Center until the very last moment he could do so. And in this later image, Stanley is encouraging me to keep writing social theory and to argue, as I did in my thesis with him that later became the book Sadomasochism in Everyday Life, about the complexities of power dynamics as they operate both at the level of individuals and of groups. This older Stanley strongly encouraged me to become the chair or the executive officer, as Michelle knows we're called, of the PhD program in sociology at the Graduate Center, an administrative position I was frankly very hesitant to take on. So why did Stanley feel so strongly about my becoming the chair of the program he taught in for so many decades? Perhaps he thought, as per the theme of today's tributes to Stanley's multifaceted legacies, that I would somehow carry on something of his intellectual, political, and broadly speaking, cultural legacy. And so I have organized these brief remarks around a group of 6 themes that I'll quickly summarize that perhaps evoke the intellectual spirit of Stanley's legacy as I encountered it, first as an undergraduate, then as a graduate student, and now as a professor, and yes, a department chair. These themes are cultural in the broadest sense, because I think for Stanley, ideas and culture were interrelated. There wasn't a clear separation, I don't believe, between his ideas on culture or education or class structure or labor or movements. So let me go through these themes quickly. One, first and foremost, Stanley believed ideas matter, as people have been saying all through the day in different ways. Not only was he against false promises, but false dichotomies. Specifically, he saw no contradiction between theoretical ideas and social movement activism, as people sometimes divide over when thinking of themselves either as theorists or activist practitioners. Rather, what I took from Stanley, among many things, was that intellectual work matters. Ideas can and do change the world, as is both by now a cliche and also an easy to forget insight. So I vividly recall Stanley's classes or shared meetings with Stanley in and out of the Graduate Center, feeling passionately inspired and leaving with a sense of excitement is the word that comes to mind, about learning, debating, discussing, arguing, and of course, writing. Whether it was co-authoring the book, The Jobless Future, with Bill DeFazio, another dear friend and colleague of Stanley's, who died a few years ago or would have been with us on this panel, I believe for sure, or whether writing with Donna Gaines or Margaret Yard in a cultural study group we were in that worked on a post-work manifesto. Stanley's spirit, I think, definitely included a passionate commitment to debate and learning and to the critical importance of ideas, and by extension, the academy at its intellectual best, not its corporatized worst. But a second interrelated theme in Stanley's work was a belief in, I think, just as passionate, in the complexity and multidimensionality of ideas. He was the opposite of a reductionist, as again, some people have said throughout the day. Rather, early on, going back to the late 60s and 70s, Stanley recognized the problems of any kind of orthodox Marxism that did not properly allow for understanding and acting on the relative independence from the structural workings of class-based inequalities, of racial, sexist, and heterosexist discriminations. These were both and, not either or, propositions for Stanley, even early on for Stanley, as he profoundly understood both that class matters, but that, as Cornel West famously entitled one of his books, so does race, sexism, heterosexism, and other kinds of ongoing discriminatory dynamics. Indeed, this was the theme of his early book, The Crisis in Historical Materialism, which argued that the traditional Marxist paradigm did not grasp the importance of what later came to be called new social movements. And then a third theme in Stanley's cultural thought, as I am broadly and interrelatedly defining it, involved exploding another false dichotomy, this one between objective external social structures and so-called subjective conditions, which Andrew was referring to in discussing subjectivity, by which we are affected in our psyches and our everyday lives. In other words, Stanley, like Frankfurt School's theorists he taught and admired, from Marcuse and Benjamin to Horkheimer and Adorno, was as culturally interested in the workings and psychic dynamics of our existence as he was in the structures of capitalism, patriarchy, and how racism and capitalism become intertwined. Thus, not only could Stanley be dubbed an early intersectional theorist, but more than a theorist like Pierre Bourdieu, who at least consciously pushed away Freudian ideas, Stanley did socioanalytic theorizing, and I think got that the reproduction of oppressive political dynamics is impossible without the involvement of unconscious psychic processes, as is an underside and collaborator with the Marxist notion of ideology. Distinctively too, and influenced by Ellen Willis, as he was in many ways. I think this is important that he both influenced Ellen and Ellen influenced him, I think quite mutually, and importantly, that Stanley was interested in the work of Wilhelm Reich and how sexual, not just emotional and psychic repression, can also contaminate possibilities of human liberation and of personal and political transformations. My fourth and fifth themes, because I'm going to combine them, about this cultural spirit that I got from Stanley, are again interconnected. For fourthly, Stanley was not only consciously willing to embrace pragmatic politics, whether through labor movement involvement and advocacy, or as people probably continue to smile throughout the day as we recall his running for governor of New York State on the Green Party in 2002. Both Stanley and Ellen believed in sketching, in envisioning, in articulating so-called utopian visions as part of intellectuality and theorizing, and a commitment to trying to offer alternatives. Again, with Ellen, this might involve envisioning a world far more liberated in emotional and psychic ways and in terms of sexual and feminist freedoms. But in Stanley's case, the belief in the importance of utopian visions very frequently, constantly involved pushing back against a world of work without end, as more and more characterizes our own era. So for Stanley, returning to Marx, liberatory dreams had to envision, had to emphasize the freeing up of time so that people could pursue interests in playing music or making films or doing political work or dancing or talking and giving courses, and in the beauty of learning for learning's sake and not only strategically. For Stanley, pragmatism and utopianism were as intimately connected and not falsely dichotomized as leisure and work. And here I hope that maybe students of Stanley's in the future will eventually return to update False Promises, the early book that so many of us have mentioned, because of questions of meaning in a contemporary world where utopian visions need badly to be actualized and to offer political and cultural inspiration. Sixth and finally, and I am kind of come close to the end here, Michael, so I hope I'm not taking too long, but sixth and finally, I think Stanley valued intellectuality and theorizing and complexity, but wonderfully and distinctively, he was not whether it was Nona talking this morning or any of us as students will continue to say, he was not in my fondest memories of him in any way an elitist whatsoever. It was exactly the opposite. For Stanley, popular culture was as valuable as so-called high culture. Rock music interested him, as did jazz and classical, roll over Beethoven indeed for Stanley, and as well as in TV shows, movies, films of all kinds that indeed one could talk about for hours and hours with Stanley's, just as much as you could talk about Adorno, Horkheimer, or Marcuse. Most of all, I think Stanley looked down on academic pursuits that were motivated primarily by desires for academic prestige, for jockeying in the academy, rather than by intellectual and political desires to explore and actualize thought beyond what he saw as elitist intellectual distinctions and hierarchies. In conclusion, I return to the title of this all-day conference, Carrying It On, and what it meant for Stanley, for me, for others who knew or may come to know about him through a conference like this one. For last and not least, I want to say that I was always rather awestruck, very awestruck, by Stanley's attitudes toward life, his sense of humor, as well as his sense of the absurd, so much that very few people know this about me, that I seriously thought of writing a biography of him, which I never actually did. For I was amazed at how positive a person Stanley always was, constantly learning and thinking about new ideas, next ideas, the new book he was thinking about and going to write, animatedly telling anyone who would listen, who he just met or long knew, about what music he was listening to, which new student's work he admired or would constantly brag about, or what fantastic piece of theory or philosophy he was reading or rereading. So that perhaps most of all, and this is where I hope I don't cry myself, or if I do, it's okay, thanks to Michael and Michelle. What I took away from Stanley is that carrying it on entails never giving up on intellectuality in the broadest sense, never giving up on utopian dreams and social theorizing, never giving up on the possibilities of institutional and social structural and interpersonal psychic changes, never giving up on visions of people leaving behind a better world, but also gaining and advocating for enjoying work and for more leisure, never giving up on progress toward greater freedom from non-reducible hatreds and biases like racism and ethnic prejudice and sexism and heterosexism, and yes, never giving up on a cultural ethos of caring and humanity as a way to live that Stanley influenced me to keep nurturing in myself, and which I try and will continue to try to the best of my capacities in and of course beyond the Graduate Center, to carry on with my own students and friends and my own life. For all the encouragement and support he provided me, and for which I will be grateful always, I will always remember and try to carry on the cultural spirit of Stanley Aranowitz that I was fortunate enough to experience and to imbibe. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, so much. Beautifully done. And I know we can return to many of these 6 themes in a very organized way. You again set a very good table for us. You know, we have the emotional, the work, and now the thematic all working together. So I'm going to go on to our last speaker before we go to a kind of roundtable format. Kristin Lawler, a very dear friend, someone that is part of the Situations Journal Collective, was a former board member of the Left Forum when Stanley was still active with the Left Forum. She is a professor in sociology at Mount St. Vincent College in Mount St. Vincent College, the College of, excuse me, professor of sociology, the author of American Surfer, if I had the title correct, right? A very interesting cultural study, as well as writing very good things on the Mediterranean imaginary for us on situations, and actually giving talks on this to our Greek comrades during the Syriza uprising back in the middle part of last decade, which we're trying to reconstitute further from the left this time, hopefully. So Kristin, welcome. She's also a member of the Institute for the Radical Imagination, has taught courses on labor and Irish culture in the United States and its militancy, etc. And very interested now in cinema and making films, and in order to promote the radical imagination in a different way. So welcome, Kristin. Glad to have you here. And
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to the organizers of this amazing day. I'm so honored to be here and in such wonderful company. I feel incredibly inspired by this project of carrying on the amazing work that Stanley did as whole life. And that's inspired so many of us so profoundly. I'm really honored to be here to pay tribute to Stanley's work and to be part of this project, especially to think through the present moment, which obviously all kinds of really unprecedented things are happening. And I think we need more than ever to understand how to think about them, how to engage with some things that are some same old, but some things are sort of radically new. Stanley was my teacher and my friend. I miss him a great deal, but his thinking about the social world was so rich and generative, so generous and wide ranging that it's easy for me to still feel Stanley's presence because I'm always still thinking with him. I find this especially now when the pandemic has upended the structures of everyday life all over, and the culture of the refusal of work, what Stanley called the counter logic of the working class in the tradition of the autonomous theorists like Negri is seemingly sort of sweeping the nation. I think this is extraordinary, and I miss Stanley more than ever right now. Working class culture is once again showing itself to be an independent subjectivity to which capital and the state must respond. More than just a means of reproduction, although of course it is that as well, culture is also both an expression and a means toward working class power. This is what I see as uniting Stanley's work on culture in all its really incredibly wide range, which is that he always considered matters of cultural texts and the rhythms of everyday life in terms of this project of working class emancipation, really freedom in time and in space. And specifically, his project was to show the way in which the subsumption of culture and everyday life by the logic of capital is never complete. And the total capture of the life world is in fact challenged by working class cultural practices, that the desire for pleasure and autonomy was constitutive of these practices and gave them their subversive edge, all capital's attempt to crush or to co-opt them notwithstanding. Stanley refused to, in his words, wallow in the economism that he saw as characteristic of orthodox Marxism. He examined the way in which capitalism is both reproduced and subverted by cultural practices, both in the sense of the cultural contradictions of capital itself, in commercially mediated texts like films, music, stuff like that, that it produces, as well as in the cultural practices of the working class, which form the concrete texture of everyday life. So like Lynn, I laid out a couple of different just thematic points that I thought I could sort of skip stones over a little bit, and then we could decide how we want to take things up in the roundtable. But, first and foremost, he really taught us how to read cultural texts. This idea that literature is social knowledge, that film and music is social knowledge. In the essay, Literature as Social Knowledge, he says approvingly of Bakhtin that he offers criticism as a way to explore the relationship between text and context, that is resolutely anti-reductionist, but instead insists that social life is embedded in the narrative in a way not available to more abstracted disciplines, such as sociology, economics, and even historiography. So, and even more than that, it's that there was a way in which we were all encouraged to do this kind of collective, joyful, close reading of cultural products. Together, we all took movies and novels seriously in the way that the best play activities are serious, infused with intense attention, which, as Simone Weil reminds us, is the highest form of love. And there's a lot of great stuff he says about this, about Raymond Williams in that essay in Dead Art. It's live theories. And then, of course, another theme is the way that culture in the form of bourgeois ideology functions to reproduce the logic of capital, whether in, chapter 4 of False Promises about colonized leisure, trivialized work, or his discussions of Althusser, Gramsci, of film as the art form of late capitalism, this sort of machinic destruction of time, which is parallel to that wrought by mass production. There's no question. We were all encouraged as his students to, have a good eye for, ideology, and it's everywhere, of course. But also his work looked at the subversiveness of popular culture, which he saw as a function of what he called, of course, Daniel Bell did too, but the cultural contradictions of capitalism. And actually, in a new later introduction to False Promises, he actually says that he thought that colonized leisure, trivialized work chapter was fatally shaped by his involvement with, studying Frankfurt School and C. Wright Mills, and their disdain for any utopian element in mass culture. So it's not that it wasn't true, but he certainly, in the interim between like 73 and 92, when I guess the new edition came out, he'd been moved by a more post-structuralist understanding of language and popular culture, and saw working class politics of time, pleasure, play, and something utopian in mass culture's democratizing impulse. He talks about, laid out by Benjamin. Of course, Ellen Willis famously, quoted Lenin's remark that the capitalists will sell you the rope to hang him with. And this, for him, had a lot to do with this kind of dialectic between work and play. He says the advent of consumer society disrupts the unequal international division of labor and places in jeopardy all authoritarian and totalitarian societies which are undergirded by global inequality. To say this means to challenge the traditional work ethic upon which the critique of colonized leisure is based. The dialectic of leisure may retain the call for autonomous cultural production as a necessary condition for its democratization, but it also implies what Marcuse makes explicit, that the fundamental human struggle is over time to reduce the amount of necessary labor required for the reproduction of life and to obtain thereby freedom from alienated labor, the use of which is a measure of individual and collective freedom. And so, of course, this is, coming up all through the day. It's so important. A radical cultural politics, he says, ruptures the traditional liberal and Marxist orientations in which socially sanctioned behavior, privileges work. And all of this has to do with what I see as really, to me, when I think of Stanley on culture, it's really this idea of what I call the cultural politics of the class struggle. And I'm so thrilled that people are talking so much about The Crisis in Historical Materialism, because it is the most extraordinary book. And in it, he sort of lays this out, that this anti-work ethic is the main characteristic of the cultural logic of the working class. In its everyday life, a logic constituted by rhythms of time and presence in space that, in his words, remain oppositional to accumulation. It is an oppositional logic of life, of vitality, of spontaneity. Stanley calls it a counter logic of, quote, the erotic, play, and the constituting subject. That always challenges capital's instrumentalizing logic, its push to subsume living labor and make it an inert and passive object, among other objects of the process of producing surplus value. So in laying out this cultural counter logic, the study of which he said in The Crisis in Historical Materialism was long overdue. So the study of these cultural politics are long overdue. And I think that's more true now than ever. I mean, really, really now. Things are really changing and happening in ways that I think make it really appropriate that we all sort of recommit to this. So Stanley puts it this way: the logic of labor is to seek every opportunity to transform work into play, or more precisely, to make as large a portion of working time unproductive from capital's point of view. He calls it the insertion of the erotic into working life, and says it violates the cultural norms of capital, which historically demanded the strict separation of eros and civilization. So, in Stanley's analysis, because the two classes are antagonistic subjects that face each other at the point of production and reproduction with mutually contradictory interests, then reality in capitalism is shaped by the indeterminate outcomes of their struggle. This includes, of course, crises in capitalism that a more economistic Marxism would posit as outcomes of contradictions in the mode of production. So he sort of talks about the undecidability of historical development, and that focusing on this sort of radical cultural politics and sort of antagonistic subjectivity of the working class helps us see the undecidability of historical development, which really means hope and optimism and possibility. He says to show its jagged side. He wanted to show the jagged side of the more machinic kind of orthodox Marxist analysis. So there's something, deeply sort of optimistic about this idea, and it's a warning sign too. I mean, in False Promises, when he talks about the does the chapter on Lordstown and all of the sort of the counter logic of labor taking center stage in the form of wildcat strikes and sort of anti-authoritarianism on the line, and these kind of young, like hippie influenced workers. It's a sad story, and a story reminiscent of George Akas's great work on the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. The union's bad cultural politics, their disavowal of the countercultural logic of the workers themselves, set them up for failure. And I mean, the Lordstown plant is closed now. But still at that time, the counterculture that he describes threw capital into crisis. He says it was a result of an oppositional cultural logic of the working class and the middle strata, the movements of women and youth that refused the authoritarian logic of capital accumulation. So I think that, he talks in very similar ways in the Politics of Identity about the ecology movement and the way in which, it is, whether he's talking about Black liberation, women's liberation, queer liberation, the environmental movement, all kinds of other things that, as people have talked about, can sort of easily be seen as so separate from class politics. When you approach class politics from this perspective of this oppositional cultural logic of life and spontaneity and play, all kinds of liberation movements and ecology and all of that, you can see very clearly that they're of a piece. I have a bunch more stuff here, but I think I've talked for too long. What I wound up doing in this was sort of move into the question of, so what do you do with this? How do you organize this? Andrew brought that up, I think, really nicely. And what does it mean to occupy this contradictory position with respect to spontaneity and institutions? And Stanley used to say to us that institutionalization is the repository of scarcity, which is, of course, true in many ways, but it doesn't mean you don't have to. We live our lives in them in some ways, and so for me, what he did in educational spaces was precisely the kind of moment of taking that intense love for the world and close reading of the world, and sort of collective activity for its own sake. I mean, he taught at the Graduate Center, but he never enforced a deadline. He never was like, you didn't do your work. He never bossed anybody. He was a teacher completely. And he taught us that this was worthwhile for its own sake. And it was a joy. It was an absolute joy. And one thing that I really love about Stanley on sort of culture and education is the way in which so many of his students, so many of the people who were so deeply influenced by him continue to create these spaces around them. There are generations of, Stanley's students and grand students and stuff like that, and who are doing these close readings of the world animated by deep, deep love for it. So thank you so much. It's been really nice to honor Stanley this way. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you so much. Great. Yeah, Stanley was never a boss, never had that little cop in his head, as you like to say about cop consciousness. And thank you so much for that. That's a great way to frame this. So I would like to, maybe turn this now into a good roundtable. Michelle, you have to leave a little early, pretty soon, or yeah.
I'm out. Thank you. As I said so sorry I have to pop off. Thanks for bathing together in Stanley. And
I'm going to open up because I wanted to hear from you if you have 1 second. Stanley and I used to love a phrase of Herbert Marcuse on the critique of repressive tolerance, that America education is the systematic moronization of the populace. And just if you had a thought about that proposition, Stanley liked to call the educational system, basically planned ignorance. So since you're a specialist and you've done so much work in this, can you give us like the short skinny on this, where you see
the
this?
short skinny, yeah, the cliff notes on the decay of public education. I think it's a battleground right now. I think there are some incredible radical mobilizations of parents and teachers and progressive communities and young people, and we are watching absolute assault by privatizers, conservatives, picking at the carcass of that which is public and penetrating the kind of marrow of the public through school boards, through well-funded grasstops, parents' rights groups, through white supremacy, anti-LGBTQ, mislabeled anti-CRT. I see scared teachers, even in New York City, not just in Mississippi, but I also see in the Aranowitz morning after, radical mobilizations. There are hundreds of teacher reading groups of Howard Zinn's curriculum, of the movement for Black Lives textbooks. And so, as is maybe always true, there is a fierce backlash and radical new solidarities erupting. But that is the work of City University. We better be igniting those fires and not participating in the neoliberal silencing of radical possibilities in public schools. I don't want to end by talking about the decay of that which is public, because the right is more than happy to use all of our words to promote that argument. And yet this is a time where we must stand up, and CUNY has not been courageous. CUNY has not been courageous around public education and the rights for a liberatory education. And yet individuals within and movements within CUNY have been gorgeous. Right. Goodbye, all.
Thank you so much.
In the spirit of carrying on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, great. Okay, so in terms of proceeding, I mean, maybe you could ask each other questions. I mean, I took copious notes. I want to just make a couple of comments going back to Andrew and the Italian school in some ways. A little anecdote again on Stanley. The false promises, by the way, was mimeographed in Italy and translated. And Ferruccio Gambino did this and passed it around. This lived an underground existence, for many, many years that influenced, of course, Negre and others. going forward. I'm sure Lazzarato is aware of this work and its influence too. And so there was this very deep connection that was kind of an underground existence during the 70s, right? Which also had a very positive moment with the Feltrinelli Publishing House, which was the, left communist publishing house in Italy. So I think, this is something else that people fail to recognize. Not only was he a national hero in a way, or as Peter McLaren called him, a national treasure, right, in the United States. Stanley had a really internationalist reach, right, in so many ways. And especially during the movements of the 70s, he was integral to many of the workers' movements in the 70s. He knew Andre Gortz. He knew Gortz well. He was in Paris in the 70s. He became friends with Henri Lefebvre. So we're not talking about someone that was just here rolling over Beethoven or, looking at Lordstown. We're talking about somebody who had much greater reach, right, in terms of the internationalist context. And I think this is important to point out. Anyway, I really appreciate it. Maybe we could begin here, Andrew mentioning and Lynn, working back towards it on the level of consciousness and subjectivity. What do we see here in terms of this movement from Stanley, from consciousness to subjectivity? Stanley and I spoke about Jean-Paul Sartre often, and in terms of that movement from being in nothingness to search for a method. And another little anecdote, in 1965 and 66, when in Puerto Rico, he read the Critique of Dialectical Reason in French. So that's how he amused himself while he was organizing, bring a book of theory with you and talk about theory anyway, the Sartrean, masterpiece, if you will, and at least in terms of political and social theory. So maybe we could go back to this in terms of this division that happens in education, happens in our lives, and how you would maybe respond to this this moment that happened to him, this return to subjectivity, because a lot of the post-structuralists, as you know, Louis Althusser said, history is a process without a subject. Lacan and Foucault certainly mentioned, the sujet, right? Only subject and subjection. But subjectivity was really not on the table. And could this be a moment of Stanley going back to the Lukácsian notion of totality, the Sartrean notion of totality, and the Frankfurt School's return as well, against the post-structuralist overemphasis, if you will, on the grammar of the day, the grammatology, to use the Derridian title of a major book of that period. So I maybe like to begin the discussion that way. Maybe it's, I mean, I know I'm mired in abstractions here, but please.
Lynn, would you like to go, or should I?
Go ahead, Andrew, please.
Okay. Well, so I would say a couple of things. One is that, I don't claim to have encyclopedic knowledge of Stanley's work. He's written so much, and I've only been able to read a portion of it. Nor could I write the biography that I hope Lynn will one day write, or will help someone else to write, because we badly need it, both a political and intellectual biography for somebody who accomplished so much and whose range was almost impossible to summarize. I think that part of his taking up of the term subjectivity was rooted in a much older, sort of realization or orientation that is present from False Promises, which is that that workers struggle and dream and experiment in myriad ways. And I think that this is something that Kristin pointed out as well. The kind of joyful, rebellious nature of work at Lordstown was also kind of involving cultural experimentation, right? Wearing long hair, wildcat strikes were overlapping with use of drugs. And to kind of separate these things maybe in an analytic way creates a sort of false paradigm. I think that for me, seeing in Stanley's work a sort of a gradual effacement of the use of consciousness for me, that symbolized something that was really core to his critical pedagogical approach, right? You know, in Frere, you have the notion of education as banking, right, where the teacher deposits information into the pupil's head, and the pupil, you know, gobbles it up and imbibes it and accepts it for what it is, and then achieves the knowledge that the teacher had, right? Frere is completely opposed to this, right? Frere is interested in a dialogic process of education whereby indeed the teacher or the pedagogue plays some role in perhaps structuring or setting up the conversation or discussion, but where students play an active role in constructing new knowledge. And part of that is based on their outside experience. Part of that is based on the very real expertise they have in the world they inhabit. But so to link this to consciousness, I think that, you know, the paradigm, the kind of old dead paradigm of a certain kind of orthodox Marxism, that class consciousness is something to be achieved, right? It's waiting out there, and hopefully at some point the masses can come to the realization of their true destiny because it's already inscribed, it's already waiting in the objective wings. I think that notion has to go out the window, right? Because subjectivity takes us in a direction, a completely different direction, right? Which begins from recognizing that people are engaged in a multitude of activities and practices. People have ideas about the world they inhabit, sometimes contradictory ones, but they have, you know, an agency and a sort of activity that any political project needs to begin from. And then, you know, the last thing I'll say is that I think, you know, the psychoanalytic dimensions of subjectivity are maybe something Lynn can speak to, but I do think that this notion of subjectivity needs to be linked to the problem of organization in some ways, right? It needs to be both a sort of intersubjective and social and political subjectivity. This I think is where his interests lie, although I know that also he was, you know, a very sharp psychoanalyst in his own way, right, and reader of those texts. But so maybe that can kind of provide some fuel for the rest of you to chime in. Thanks.
Bruce, could you speak to the unconscious here and subjectivity maybe, and both through your own work and what you see and in Stanley's shifting from consciousness to subjectivity, and maybe speculate on what that may have been, since you were working with him during that period too. So
You're calling me, right?
Yes, I am. Yes, Lynn. Yeah.
So a while ago, I never completed, I started to do something about whether social theorists in sociology use psychoanalysis and Freud. And I interviewed Stanley for it. And, you know, Stanley, of all the well-known theorists I interviewed, was the most, I think, open to and interested in using notions of the unconscious. And I think it goes back to, you know, pretty obviously the Frankfurt School connections and being willing to put together Freud and Marx, but particularly the notion of ideology, because I find it very interesting that ideology in how it operates, since we're talking about workers, you're not conscious of it in some ways. So I think Stanley was very much understood that not just emotions, you know, seeing human beings multidimensionally, not simply rationally, not simply emotionally, but also possessed of conscious and unconscious dynamics. And again, I was mentioning, I mean, this is something I saw Michelle nodding her head, but I do think he and Ellen were very, very close intellectually, as well as politically, and that she was very interested in his class politics, and he was very interested in her feminist and also psychoanalytic politics. So what does that mean for subjectivity? I feel like for Stanley, he was very, very interested in arguments that might use multidimensional levels of, and actually theorizing and political work that didn't assume people were rational beings. I think that was like very obvious to Stanley. I also think he taught courses at the Graduate Center. At some point, he did one on self and society or psychoanalysis and society. So it's like a very strong interest in him. But I'm linking it to not only the Frankfurt School, but it seems part and parcel of understanding that transformation is going to require going beyond ideology and sort of pushing to see how it is that people are acting in ways that don't really make sense. And that it goes back to Lukács. You know, he's always had that interest. So I see it as very part and parcel of his intellectual development. I think what you're talking about, Andrew, to maybe you want to respond, is like more about how does subjectivity get involved, you know, sort of interpersonally and in terms of activism and political organizing and labor organizing. I think he believed it was important, but that he didn't use that to the exclusion. He was not simplistic as a thinker in any way, shape, or form.
No, not at all. I just wanted to add, and then I'll let Kristin speak, but I just want to add, given what both you and Andrew said, you know, Stanley in some ways, even though he loved the meta work of Marcuse, Eros and Civilization, pretty much came down more on the side of Erich Fromm and the notion of intersubjective praxis. He was very much involved in the practical aspects of this attempted synthesis of Marx and Freud and that possibility. So, you know, he in some ways, ironically, despite all the relationship and fondness for Marcuse's thought, came much closer to Frommian psychoanalysis or the Frommian, you know, kind of attempt. And this is certainly something worthy of consideration, the intersubjective praxis of this member or peripheral member of the Frankfurt School, you know, whom he knew personally as well. And well,
maybe Kristin answered that, but I'd love to come back to that point, Michael. It's a really
sure,
interesting.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, please, Kristin. Yeah, yeah. And Kristin's middle name is Lawless, by the way. That's her. Yeah. So we have the unconscious unchained here, unleashed, right?
I think that there was something, I mean, when I think of Stanley and sort of subjectivity, I think of a couple of things. One is the way in which, one of the things that made his writing so engaging and his teaching too, because he would tell sort of stories, was, you know, like he wrote Cultural Politics of the Popular Front. And it was an analysis of, you know, sort of the cultural, what Denning called the cultural front, you know, hootenannies, these kinds of spaces of countercultural pleasure and stuff like that. But it wasn't just this sort of cold analysis, it was about his life and his experience of things. And so there was this incredibly sort of rich subjectivity that did not necessarily have to do with the sovereign subject disciplining the wildness of the unconscious, you know, sort of, that wasn't where the subjectivity came from. So in a way, there was a way in which, you know, he, I don't know what's exactly the right word, but he sort of embodied both of them. What he didn't embody so strongly was the intense sort of superego that makes subjectivity under capitalism such a drag. So he, you know, that's the part of Marcuse and Eros and Civilization that, you know, I learned from him and took very much to heart, sort of the idea that instinctual liberation on the level of libido, you know, broadly speaking, is precisely what makes possible, you know, a political subjectivity and also potentially a post-revolutionary subjectivity that is constituted by pleasure and autonomy and not sort of repression and not even necessarily consciousness. So.
Great. Thank you, Kristin. Yeah, Lynn, you want to speak to yeah.
Just so interested because I think of Stanley as more influenced by Marcuse than by Fromm. So I find it very, very interesting that you were making that connection, Michael. So
Yeah, I was just trying to go in the direction of this notion of both organization and intersubjective experience, you know, and that Fromm had this very practical sense about him. And in discussion with Stanley that I had about this, he seemed to take the side that sometimes the neo-Freudian movement, right, which Marcuse critiqued very much, and as you know, Russell Jacoby, even more so in the book Social Amnesia, you know, that somehow the Frommian moment was, to Stanley, something that could be used politically more at that time, that intersubjective, you know, process, much more practically oriented in some ways. But I certainly agree with, you know, Kristin. Stanley was completely about this unleashing of the instinct to the man, understood repressive desublimation extremely well, and would certainly, I'm not trying to posit one or the other, but it seems like he chose more, you know, towards the notion of subjectivity and everyday human life. It was a Reich Frommian connection at some point than it was, you know, the more meta discourse of the Marcuses. That's where I'm coming from. Yes, Andrew, and then yeah, we have the chat. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. If I could just jump in, one thing, Kristin, I really appreciated from your presentation was the notion of the jagged side of a mechanistic analysis. That Stanley was really interested in this jagged side, and it's a really powerful image that that I hope to use, and I will credit you, of course. But when thinking about the jagged side of history, I also, you know, have been thinking about this in the present context. Some of you might be familiar already with, you know, Reddit. There's a subreddit called Anti-Work, which has received a flood of, you know, hundreds of thousands of members in recent months. And this is a forum where people post stories about quitting work, or why they hate their jobs, or why they have begun to form, you know, autonomous or union-based organizations with their coworkers. And there's a real culture of sort of appreciating and valorizing that activity. And so I think it's something that Stanley would, and, you know, people include photographs and, you know, text messages with their boss, and there's a real sort of texture of the everyday life of workers, and this sort of refusal that's percolating. But it's not always yoked to some kind of coherent political program, right? It's not always kind of fed into, you know, a political organization. You know, to Stanley's argument again in the talk that we heard between this panel and the last one, you know, the left kind of has failed in some ways to have a unified organization that's able to respond to all of the multitude of issues that come up for everyday people, and provide a sort of alternative ideology, right? A counter-hegemonic program that can knit those together in a way that makes sense, right? And that can gain traction in a way that, you know, for example, the Democratic Party or the sort of liberal center in the US has repeatedly failed to do, especially in recent years and months. So, you know, I think Stanley would be fascinated by this forum, and I would love to see an Aranowitz analysis of meme culture. I don't know that we'll ever get it, but maybe one of his students or grand students, another phrase I really liked, could do that for us. So.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on just a little bit, maybe to another very prescient category that we really should talk about, given Striketober and the new Great Resignation, this strategy of refusal that both you, Andrew, and Kristin are very well immersed in, and Lynn, in terms of the power of ideas to really catch fire out there. Maybe we can merge all of those three, and also, and I want to add to this a sixth notion that Lynn had, that Stanley was never an elitist, right? Never an elitist, really just down to earth. I mean, you know, the stories and everything from the bathroom to the living room to the kitchen, the shirt, you know, etc. You know, I remember one time when he gave the commencement address at the College of New Haven. He was asked to be the commencement speaker, and he was so proud of his blue blazer And I said, it looks like we're going to prep school. And he really laughed and he said, yeah, I really wanted to go to one of those schools, but we couldn't afford it. So anyway, so these were really just great moments. The gold buttons on the blazer. Is it clean, Michael? Yeah, it's clean, don't worry. And then the limousine comes to pick him up. We had a great day. And then he tells the students they have no future in the job market, of course, later in the day. But I want to go back to this, this refusal of work, right? The zero work movement, the refusal of work. I know that Andrew certainly knows this extremely well. Kristin has worked on this for a very long time, and I know Lynn's into it completely. So maybe we can have a discussion, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Yeah, after that. I thought this was another theme that's right in our midst that maybe we can comment upon. So whichever one of you wants to start. Kristin, I know you're, yeah, good. Okay.
I just, this is like so exciting to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one like this. I feel like I'm living through the tight labor market I've always dreamed of, the quit rate being really high, and all of these, people just refusing work in this mass way. I do think it's incredibly sort of powerful, available to be mobilized. And also, so I want to kind of talk about that part of it, but also it speaks to Stanley's discussion of everyday life. He's got a great essay on Lefebvre, but this idea of the structures of everyday life under capitalism, and the way in which they, what they do is reproduce the social relations of production, right? So it's very interesting to me to look back when the pandemic began and people were saying, I think we got to maybe stay home a minute so we don't keep on spreading this virus around. And the Chamber of Commerce shit a brick, of course. And they were like, no. And all the bosses were like, no, you have to keep going to work, because they knew that when that everyday life, when those sort of repressive structures of everyday life were broken and people sort of had, now not everybody, I mean, things changed in different ways, and it's very uneven and unequal and unfair, like everything else in capitalism. But for lots and lots of people, the regular structures of everyday life were upended. Many people entered into a very existential moment that seems really appropriate to the time that we're living in right now. And I think this is really, really profound. And anyway, just to see that, I feel like that's something Stanley would have predicted. When the repressive structures of everyday life are transformed, lifted, broken, delegitimized in some way, something opens up, a possibility opens up. And I think that's, and this sort of counter logic that radical cultural politics start to emerge, and I think that's something that we're really seeing. It's unclear what will happen, but this is the last thing I'll say. Stanley did used to. He's the one that gave me this idea that the world teaches you really, really well, that lots of people learn just from the world and not necessarily from, other kinds of study. So I don't know, you can, write a book and talk about how tight labor markets give workers power, and that's a way to raise wages, that the refusal of work is an amazing way to raise wages outside the sort of representative structure of the union and collective bargaining, which, he was a real critic of. So, the world is teaching us that is true. Workers are learning some really important lessons about the power of refusal, and what the autonomous also called sort of, the idea of the antagonistic subjectivity of the working classes. It's the refusal of work on one side, and the self-valorization of the class, the independent projects, the things constituted by pleasure and autonomy. That's what sort of class struggle is really made of. Working class struggle is made of, and I just feel like all the ideas Stanley ever taught me are borne out right now. It's indeterminate. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's sort of an interesting time. And it's one more way in which it's just tragic when the spigot gets turned off of someone brilliant. It's not just that you miss someone that you love, it's also that really you're like, God, I wish I could just have this conversation. And but we have to carry it on in a different way, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, Andrew, you want to actually, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well,
Yep,
I
sorry.
was trying to think of an artful way of combining these reflections about the tight labor market and the academic job market, which I'm currently experiencing. I'm wondering when it's going to tip over into that world. We'll see. But certainly, I think as Kristin was saying, the pandemic really broke a sort of common sense, ritualistic sort of reproductive sort of orientation of capitalist society. I think that, and even though it has impacted people in very, very disparate ways, and even though, the bailouts, for example, ended up vastly increasing the wealth of a few, nevertheless, something I do think was broken, and I do think that we're still experiencing the sort of some of the subjective results of that break, even if that break was sort of outside of the control of sort of individual struggles, right? It was sort of imposed in a way by the virus, and also by states in their own way. So I think that, I think this question of where things are going to go from here is one that Stanley, would not be one to sort of offer us firm predictions. But I do think that, to Michelle's point earlier, that public institutions and the refuges we do have, the radical organizations and sort of places like Situations, right, and that are able to sort of maintain and cultivate a sort of space where reflection on what's going on can be connected to a long tradition of theorizing and just historical memory of diverse movements. I think that now is the time when those institutions are more important than ever, and that their ability to kind of speak to and reflect back to movement participants, a sort of larger legacy and kind of movement culture, I think is essential. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was going to go to Lynn. I was muted.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Then I'm going to go to the chat.
Just
We have some very good questions.
Quick
Yeah.
comment on that. It's something I didn't say when I was trying to evoke this spirit of working with Stanley, being a student, doing which all of us have been as students. I don't know about you, Michael, but I could say this in a sort of broad sense that that Stanley. A phenomenal thing that I cherish and will miss very much is that it felt like Stanley was not just a commitment to ideas, but to unusual and sort of being open to developing arguments and trying to understand what was going on, even if it's going against the grain of conventionally accepted arguments. It's something I really cherished about him. I used to make, I thought like provocative arguments or sort of controversial, and he would be open to that. So the current moment, sort of the great refusal we were just talking about, or we're talking about the effects of this kind of these major changes that have been started with the pandemic that are affected by it in all these complex ways. But I think, his belief and commitment to theory and ideas, that we really need complex analyses of what is facing us, because it's not just, in some ways it seems like opportunities for labor, but it's also, I walk around worrying about people losing sociality, people feeling lonely. The sort of sense that you're working with other people is now, being challenged. What does that mean for organizing, for people coming together, for just the characteristics of life in numerous ways? And how do you go beyond, if you excuse the expression, dialectically, the sort of advantages and potential downsides of the era we're facing? It seems to me that I imagine Stanley very much agreeing that the current moment cries out for, for theorizing, for thinking through, for debating, for getting people together to try to understand what to do. But it seems complicated to me.
Yes, I'll just use a slogan of his that he liked to employ at times, not so fast, right? That let's not get caught up. We need to take a step back for, some critical reflexivity and then some reflection and build the theory around it. Not that he was ever against any kind of movement. That's not the point. The point was to be able to adequately. And what I read this morning from his book in the critical theory, the introduction to the Horkheimer book, really is actually warning about that too. Without theory, we're not going anywhere. He really believed that, and never that dichotomy that split the theoretical and the practical divide. So I think this is very important to keep in mind. And I think Andrew, with the grad students and all of this too, the students and grad students should really keep this in mind. We really need history and theory together. We just don't read reactions to movements out there. It does happen in the streets, but it also is happening in the head, to use Marx's old thing, the heart is the proletariat, the head was philosophy. So there's something to be said about that even today. So I'm going to go to the chat. There's some very good remarks. I'm going to read some of the questions and maybe we can deal with this. First of all, the first audience question: did Aranowitz ever engage with the situationists who shared his interest in history and class consciousness, the Frankfurt School and Henri Lefebvre, and their core notion of radical subjectivity, especially formed by Raoul Vaneigem, right? Yeah, yes, I mean, I can say yes, of course he engaged with them and mentioned them, etc. I'll just, again, anecdotally speaking, he spent a long time in the company of Henri Lefebvre, who taught him how to, maybe go from lower level single malt all the way up to Talisker single malt, and also how to do salad a special French way. We used to have very funny, conversations about this. So he was friends with Henri Lefebvre, admired him deeply, considered him a completely undervalued, represented figure in philosophy departments, sociology departments, anthropology in many forms. In my opinion, one of the great, philosophers of the 20th century, and in argument often. So yes, and I don't know, do other people want to speak to this? Also, Situationist with Guy Debord, of course. The Society of the Spectacle was an extraordinarily, active book in Stanley's imagination. Yeah, Kristin, please. Yeah.
I do think that kind of sensibility was very much part of Stanley. It's part of Stanley's work. But I have just a little quote that I wrote down for my talk, because I always write too much, and I think that this is him talking about Henri Lefebvre. But I thought he could have been talking about himself. He declares that the merging of art and everyday life has exemplary consequences and reintroduces a different notion of progress through praxis at the most intimate level of social life, what has been termed culture. Another world is possible. And in another place in that essay, he sort of talks about, the kind of making, and I consider that a very sort of situationist, model of, creating political art out of the moments of everyday life as sort of a radical, a radical practice, creating spaces, educational spaces. The idea that unions lost everything once they stopped collecting dues at the union hall, where you could go and sort of be around people and stuff like that. So radical spaces, radical sort of artistic moments. And I do want to just sneak in one little thing about what Andrew said about the academic job market, because I do think that's, Stanley famously wrote that being a professor is the last good job in America, which of course, it is, but these days it's not what it used to be. And I do feel like because what I learned from him, one of the things I learned from him so much was the kind of refusal to privilege intellectual or mental over manual labor, that it's all just work and we need less of it, and whatever you're doing, there is something really nice about, and I think incredibly solidaristic in the sense of the collective refusal of work that we're talking about, in feeling like, yes, I'm an intellectual and I could also be a supermarket checker for money. The problem with that is that the pay is low, but then there's, you would have to organize with your fellow workers. So so it's all, in a way, I think when you start to think of it as all one labor market, it gets a little less scary in a way. Anyway.
Let me just read something from the chat that's, I think, good for us to keep going in an inspired way. As one of former students and now a retired professor, former student of Stanley, I love this discussion on the transition from consciousness to subjectivity. In the 1970s, Stanley and a group of us plowed through the field of semiotics at UC Irvine. As a supporter of Lefebvre, Stanley was most helpful in shaping my understanding of place and space, or space and place, better put. Yeah. And, this was always another thing that Stanley had. He had an openness, and, I certainly was maybe part of the discussion with him, to Heidegger, the notion of place, and of course, the production of space by Lefebvre and the notion of social space, etc. So the topological and the spatio-temporal were really operative here in his consciousness. And as Cornell mentioned this way, Stanley had this incredible ability to synthesize things. He could target something and bring it together in something, into a whole, into maybe a new totality. In many ways, he had this totalizing ability, in the positive sense. I'm using that in the Sartrean sense of the ability to take many moments, bring them together and let it happen. Okay, so Andrew or Lynn, do you want to speak to the Situationists or history? Okay, again, History and Class Consciousness was an absolute major book for Stanley, played out actively. This was the book that I think really shaped him the most. If one was going to do an intellectual biography, I throw that out, I think the starting place for the development of Stanley's intellect as it comes from reification and class consciousness of the proletariat. That this very, very rigorous attempt by Georgy Lukács, 1923, is a very fundamental text in the development of the mind and his love of ideas of Stanley Aranowitz, very, very much so. Okay, I'm going to go to a couple of more questions. We have a question about, the question has to do with building a party of the left. Some people use the word progressive that includes all the projects created to include new ways to deal with people. And related to this idea of building a party of the left, many people use the word progressive, right? Again, who need support, such as bringing women in prison, children together. There are many projects around the country that are used, many more projects around the country that are used. Couldn't the left adopt party platforms that promoted such projects as their own? Okay, let me just, I'm just going to preface this, but I really want the rest of the participants to take this on. When Stanley used party during the last decade, it was always about an agitational, educational moment, right? This was the notion of party. It was a Gramscian moment of the organic and building organic intellectuals and cadres, but through an agitational educational mix, right? He never really talked about party as electoral politics or building a party that would contend in the, political, electoral arena. So in a way, neither of us, and I mean him, very, very reasonably so and very accurately so, never adhered to representative democracy. This was completely anathema to him. So when we use these words, he would have been a supporter of Henry Wallace in the Progressive Party the last time the word was used on the national stage and ran candidates. But I'm not so sure about the party as we're talking here. But I'm going to turn it on to our great panelists here. So if anybody would like to speak to this, yeah. I know it's a complex. Lynn, you want to say a little bit about it? No?
Enter is fine.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sure. One quote that I had also written down, and I was trying to work into my talk, and I don't think it made it, from How Class Works, I think speaks to something, maybe in a sort of roundabout way, but in a piece of that book where he was actually dealing with Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's Empire, and sort of confronting this notion of exodus that was sort of introduced, not introduced in terms of those two authors came up with the concept, but advanced by them in that book. Stanley wrote that appropriate consciousness, in air quotes, right? Appropriate consciousness, so-called, does not appear spontaneously. It emerges when people discover the limits of the old and experience the frustrations associated with attempts to achieve reforms. And I've always found this to be a really helpful quote when thinking about the way that organized insubordination or organized activists might engage with processes like electoral politics or state institutions, or if we go back to the 30s, something like the New Deal, right? I think that Stanley was certainly interested in ruthless critique of the existing institutions of mainstream politics. I think there's no doubt there. There's no question there. I also think we're all probably in agreement, maybe not throughout his entire life, that Stanley was not in favor of group of school politics, of small party building initiatives in a sort of hyper Leninist vein. And so I think that, as Michael pointed out, the party is sort of a sort of cipher or placeholder or something for this notion of collective and sustained education and agitation. And, I think that takes many forms today. I don't think we can, and perhaps we should not have one party type form. Certainly the DSA might serve this function for some people, but also movement organizations like Black Lives Matter might provide it for others. And I think that the challenge is articulating these disparate organizational structures that are autonomous from the state and from capital, finding a way to articulate them such that they can add up to posing a challenge that is more than the sum of their parts, right? And I think that again, from the article, in situations of where is the outrage, Stanley was very interested in this problem of sort of episodic and sporadic resistance, not amounting to a sustained deep challenge to capitalism. And we're very much still wrestling with this question. And I think that we should not be looking only to the past for answers. We should be experimenting in practice, and many organizations and movements are. I don't mean to take a sort of didactic position on this.
I'm going to just read a quote of his, since you went to How Class Works. I'm going to go back to the Crisis in Historical Materialism in the chapter called Towards a New Strategy of Liberation. And this is on the party. This is page 165 in the chapter, again, Towards a New Strategy of Liberation. I would argue that the party occupies an ambiguous space. He begins with the Leninist notion of the party and then goes through some of the arguments in the French Communist Party during this time in the late 70s and early 80s. Within the capitalist system, not state socialisms, the left parties, in order to gain political authority within the working class, are obliged to, quote, represent, end quote, its interests, at least on the terrain of parliamentary and certain aspects of economic struggle. But the party constitutes the class as a revolutionary subject in its own image of historical necessity. This does not signify that revolution is a Sorelian myth needed to promote the party's self-imposed goals. It means, though, through its educational and agitational function, right? The party must convince a section of workers to become part of Marxism's revolutionary objectives. In other words, there's no question of representation or even of a master discourse that is fated to assume the logical center of historical change. So I think this is very crucial. I suggest to people that, again, to my mind, coming out of philosophy, this is a masterwork of Stanley's, and each chapter brims with ideas, right? And it's still extremely relevant, even though written close to 40 years ago. Yeah, Kristin, do you want to speak to the notion of the party a little bit? And yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think, it is interesting that when Stanley talks about the kinds of structures that, are sort of most important in that left forum talk that was played during lunch, which was wonderful. It's sort of about newspapers. He mentions the Trade Union Educational League. It's all sort of things that that continue to help foment this kind of militant culture and continue education and building solidarity without necessarily some kind of bureaucratic structure. And, like we've all been talking about, that's not always the easiest thing in the world to figure out how to bridge. But in, I can't remember what essay it is exactly, but it's in a couple of different places actually. And it's something that's been really influential on my thinking about the labor movement and the culture of the labor movement, which is that, there were these, he talks about sort of the Knights of Labor having come out of these earlier kinds of Irish, like the Molly Maguires and the Ancient Order of Hibernians, these sort of secret societies. And then, the Knights of Labor out west, when some of those miners moved, out to do more mining, west of Pennsylvania and Colorado and stuff like that, that became what the IWW was. And the IWW, of course, was completely quashed, but it became the CIO, and then a similar kind of post-war repression, purging of, everything that was sort of good and militant in those unions was obviously a problem. But this idea of almost like keeping the fire going through projects as being almost more important than the building of a certain kind of a structure that's organized, really, if we're thinking about structures and not sort of projects that fuel militant culture or that build solidarity or that engage people in sort of collective education, when we start thinking about we'll have this office and we'll have this bank account and we'll have this, whatever it is, this structure and these sort of ritualized practices, it's almost like you're doing it to hold on to something for a day when it's kind of dissipating, and that without that kind of fuel, without that culture that can be built in all kinds of different ways, whatever the structure is, a party or a union or whatever, it's not necessarily going to do what you want it to do. So I feel like any kind of party formation would be most useful for it to think about projects, for the projects of the radical imagination, educational, cultural, making films, creating performance art, political situations, and doing education in spaces like union halls and stuff like that, where they don't necessarily happen anymore.
Okay, thanks. Good. There's another question. How do you see or think Stanley would situate the current notion of wokeness vis-a-vis subjectivity and consciousness? So that's loaded, and yeah, we can maybe engage that a little bit too. Who would like to start with this? The wokenness as as a part of this constitution of the subjectivity and consciousness. Yeah. Anybody want to? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say, I mean, it's very hard to know what Stanley would say on any particular subject, except that, you know, I want to go back to what I emphasized before, that I think Stanley respected clear arguments that were thoughtful. So I think he, you know, clearly was a very progressive person. So he would agree with liberatory aims. And I think, of course, we were talking all through the day with social movements that are against discrimination and looking toward social and interpersonal transformation. But I think he'd also would entertain a variety of complex arguments, you know. So I think he would have been concerned, when you brought up Fromm, he would have been concerned about right-wing authoritarianism, or, you know, even the possibility of left-wing authoritarianism. I used to hear him talk about Stalinism and be as problematic, you know. So I think he was concerned historically about any kind of structures from left to right that were not reflective, self-reflective about their own goals. And so I think he would, on the one hand, be very woke, and on the other hand, be open to complexity, to arguments that looked at complexity in a variety of ways.
Excellent. Yeah, that fits with your 6 themes too. Very nice. Yeah, it fits very nicely. Kristin, you want to say something? You follow this stuff. I'm not attuned to wokenness so much.
I mean, I think to the extent that it's funny, the word woke has sort of changed meaning. It's like it holds a lot of different ideas in it now. But I mean, I tend to think of it as at this point, disparaging term for sort of neoliberal bourgeois identity politics, and the certain kind of like cancel culture, calling people out for saying things they shouldn't say and stuff like that. When, of course, and for some reason, it doesn't necessarily ever seem to cover the actual cancel culture. It's like when people say that, you know, the Palestinians are human beings, like then they get, you know, canceled. So I think that he would see it as a problematic term if it is that kind of, you know, just the neoliberal kind of jockeying for territory in professional spaces that happens. I think to the extent that it involves this kind of masochism around white fragility and all of that, I obviously don't think that would be somewhere that he would be interested in moving. But to the extent that, you know, what kind of gave rise to a lot of this was the kind of rekindling of, I think, an aspect of the Black liberation movement starting in 2015 and really heating up very intensely in the summer of 2020. You know, we'll see what happens with these, you know, trials that are, I don't know if anything's happened since I checked last in terms of, you know, verdicts or testimony, but that stuff is very serious and very much to the extent that wokeness, it'd be nice if it meant, but it never will. Now it just means something different. But if it meant what it is to understand that, you know, that solidaristic side-by-side struggle for common interests, for freedom and for more free time and freedom in space, that's something that we all share. And to the extent that there's you know, ugliness of sort of racism and white supremacy and patriarchy and all of that, then the possibility of solidaristic struggle and a world where people really are connected to one another in joyful ways is compromised, you know. So I guess I would say anybody who has good connotations about woke as like anti-police brutality, anti-racism, stuff like that, that's huge before that. But to the extent that it's about you know, some of the more extreme kinds of piling up, calling out, like all that Twitter stuff. I don't think he'd be very interested in.
If I could just read something from the chat and then something that I got through text as well. Why do those of us on the so-called left always seem to fall for the trap set by the right? I love this discussion, but I find it problematic that we use terms like woe or other rhetoric which avoids more complex thinking. I think sort of this person is talking about what Stanley may refer to in a certain way. I wanted to read that, and I thought it was a very good intervention here. And then just one other definition that I got of wokeness is the civil religion, a Rousseauian term, of liberalism. So in some ways, I don't know. I'll leave it at that. I mean, I guess we're getting into provocative, muddied waters here in a lot of ways. Okay, one other comment from the thing, and then we're going to have to close up. And as you know, and this is one of your favorites, this is a comment on the talks today. Paul Lafarge, one of Kristin's favorites, right? And Peter Bratsis, I have to mention, a philosopher and son-in-law of Marx, had written The Right to be Lazy, that explained and advocated what work should and should not mean to human beings at the end of the last century in the setting of the European capitalist urban lives were gaining momentum, as they were. This seems not to have changed in theory, although we are in different working life settings today. Stanley must have felt and understood this strongly, and so elaborated on and developed this thinking. I also agree that an intellectual group has a role to play, or else a movement without theory and awareness will not succeed. We will always remember Stanley, and thanks for the organization. All the best. So anyway, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to mention once again, I mean, this was great. This is the way he would have liked it, I think, free floating, but filled with ideas and a lot of very good conscious reflection on very, difficult matters as usual. I do want to mention again that we are doing the Stanley Aranowitz Memorial Lecture, and that you go to radicalimagination.institute, very simple to remember, radicalimagination.institute, and there's a whole section for it, and we are taking donations. We want to be able to bring top-notch speakers, usually a speaker's fee is good. We're on the left pay, at least this part of the left pay. We're not into complete volunteerism, even though, in a way today is paying homage, right? So I want to mention that again. I want to thank Andrew very much for a very, very, very solid interpretation and opening to this panel on education and culture still under siege. I emphasize the still. Right. And of course, Lynn Chancellor, who helped to put together this conference in general, right, as well as her usual very rigorous, intervention. And I think gave us a lot to work with the 6 themes in search of an author at this point, going forward. And Kristin Lawler, for as usual, a very fresh and radically inspired, discourse on what Stanley meant both to her and to cultural studies, and to, this now refusal of work that we're seeing all over. So thank you so much, everybody, for this. We have a 15-minute break. Very, very excellent panel. And thank you, everybody, again. And and be well. Yeah. And we have a little break and then testimony from many of Stanley's students who wanted to speak from 3:15 to 4:15. Thank you, everybody. Talk soon. Bye-bye.